Hey everyone, my name is Charlie and welcome to Fully Equipped. Chapter 11 contains a lot of difficult passages. Paul mainly talks about two things: head coverings in church and the Lord's Supper. The next few chapters focus on some issues that the Corinthians are having in the area of behavior when they gather for worship. Ultimately, Paul is talking about two things: the glory of God and unity in the church. The first part of chapter 11 talks about head coverings in church. More specifically, that there's an issue in the Corinthian church that the women are praying and prophesying with their heads uncovered. There is a lot of cultural context needed to properly understand this section. It's also important to understand that Paul is talking about married couples, not men and women in general. Paul begins by explaining that in a married relationship, the husband has authority over the wife. In our current day and age, it's easy to hear a sentence like that and cringe. We really struggle with the concept of submission and think that it's either outdated or demeaning. But that's not how the Bible teaches it. The husband is not controlling or forcefully making the wife do whatever he wants. He's actually supposed to lead his wife in the way that Christ leads the church, with a servant heart, love, tenderness, and care. Christ himself submits to God the Father. Though they are equally God, they have different roles in the Trinity. That's a hard thing to wrap our minds around, but it's the same concept within a marriage. The husband and wife are equal, but they have different roles. Just as the wife submits to her husband, the husband submits to Christ. And that's an important thing to emphasize, because the husband is called to be a godly leader. It's not about him, it's about leading his wife in the way of Jesus. She is submitting to God by submitting to him. He's not supposed to be her dictator, and she is not his slave. He is supposed to seek God's wisdom, guidance, and direction, and submit to that alongside his wife. And again, that's only in the context of a married relationship. It is not all men having authority over all women. So then Paul explains that it is dishonorable for a Corinthian man to cover his head in church, and for a wife to uncover her head in church. In the context of the time, the men would sometimes pull their togas over their heads to worship the pagan gods. So Paul is saying that it's dishonorable to worship Jesus in the same way that they would worship a false god. Similarly, for women, having your head uncovered in public, whether you were a Jew, Christian, or pagan, in those days was a sign of being unmarried. It's possible that it was even a promiscuous or suggestive thing. Doing so would bring shame upon her husband. The modern equivalent might be wearing really revealing clothing in church or public. It's just inappropriate and not what believers, both men and women, should be doing. So do women still need to cover their heads in church today? In a lot of cultures, head coverings are no longer a sign of being married. So for most of us, this rule isn't going to apply. Perhaps we could apply this today by choosing to wear a wedding ring. Similarly, short hair on a woman is no longer considered shameful in a lot of cultures. So it is okay to have shorter hair. Sometimes people say that it's wrong for women to wear pants, but pants aren't really associated with being a masculine clothing item anymore, so that's probably also another cultural thing. However, that doesn't mean that chapter 11 is irrelevant to us today. There are important principles to draw out of this passage, like maintaining right worship before God and conforming to our God-given genders. These commands regarding head coverings are therefore a cultural expression of the major timeless principle that the husband is the head of the marriage. Verses 7 to 9 are tricky, but ultimately Paul is pointing to the order of creation to highlight that the wife submits to the husband. Women were also created in God's image. They are not further from God than men are, and they too reflect God's glory. But the Corinthian women should continue to wear their head coverings in church as an outward sign that she is under her husband's authority. The angels are present in their worship services. which adds to the importance of following God's commands. Nowhere does Paul suggest that women are less than men. He actually points out the opposite. We both need each other. We both need to work together and serve one another. Each man and each woman is created by and valued by God. And yet, at the same time, men and women are created differently. Paul emphasizes at the end of this section on head coverings that men and women need to conform to the cultural norms of men looking like men and women looking like women. This is something that will vary from culture to culture and time to time. But the timeless truth is that gender is not a man-made construct. It is a reality given by God. There are two genders. Both genders have specific roles and purposes unique to them, and our image is supposed to reflect that reality. The second section on the Lord's Supper is also challenging in some areas. But the overarching issue is that when they gather, the Corinthians are making distinctions between the rich and the poor. When they take the cup representing Jesus' blood, and the bread representing his body sacrificed for them, they are actually doing this in a selfish and prideful way. They aren't looking out for those who are needy. And so in all of this, they're not representing Jesus well. We're called to take communion in a reverent way, because when we do so, we're remembering the sacrifice he made for us on the cross. We have to understand the significance of this when we take communion. So it's probably wise that only those who have personally given their life to Jesus should take communion. Paul warns those who take communion in an unworthy manner that they are disrespecting Jesus and his sacrifice. This warning would have been for those Corinthians who were causing division and being prideful in taking the Lord's Supper. But it could also be applied to those who are walking in unrepentant sin of any kind. So when we take communion, we should take a moment to repent for anything we have not yet asked forgiveness for. It's important to not take lightly the spiritual reality behind communion. We have to honor Christ in the way that we take it. God does discipline people who dishonor communion, but God forgives people who repent and ask for it. Ultimately, chapter 11 highlights that we need to come before God in a way that honors him and other people. How does this equip us? Chapter 11 might initially seem irrelevant to us today, but it is perhaps one of the most relevant chapters in the Bible for our modern identity crisis. A lot of it relates to cultural issues, and we can't directly apply what Paul is teaching. Some wives do cover their hair in church because of this chapter, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but ultimately one of the main points is that we are called to respect the differences that God has given men and women. We also need to respect the link between who we are, male or female, and how we look. This is a cultural thing. But also the deeper issue is that the way we act and dress and present ourselves all points to our understanding of identity and relationships. We're called to be people who are obedient to God and how he made us. We are all supposed to submit to our original design in creation, and that will mean something different to each of us. We will all have some way that we want to resist this. It's good to take some time to reflect on your identity as a man or a woman and how you express that in a godly way. In a world that is so confused in this area at the moment, let's be people who walk in the truth of our identity as a man or a woman, equally loved and valuable in the eyes of God, but with a specific role to play in glorifying him and bringing his kingdom to the world.